Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. Picture yourself walking through the cold, stone corridors of a medieval castle. The flickering torchlight casts long shadows across the walls, and you can almost smell the musty, earthy air. The sound of footsteps echoes through the halls as you walk, but there's another, less charming noise that catches your attention. The faint squelch of footsteps on stone floors. The unpleasant scent of something far more pungent than the usual medieval aromas, and the occasional gurgle that seems to come from nowhere. In fact, what you're hearing and smelling might be medieval toilets at work, because yes, back in the day, people didn't exactly have the clean, efficient plumbing we take for granted today. Instead, they had all sorts of strange, and often disgusting ways of dealing with their bodily functions. You probably wouldn't survive this situation. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments side. Love to hear where you're joining me from tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval toiletsy. They weren't exactly glamorous, were they? In fact, you might be surprised by just how different life was when it came to the most basic human needs. But hey, in the Middle Ages, people weren't exactly concerned with luxury when it came to doing their business. Instead, the focus was on what was available, and let me tell you, it wasn't always the most pleasant option. First, let's set the stage. The idea of bathrooms as we know them today didn't really exist. Imagine, for a moment, that your entire city or town has no sewage system, no running water, no sanitation. That's right, medieval folks didn't have the luxury of flushing away their waste in a convenient porcelain toilet like we do today. If you were lucky enough to live in a larger city, you might have access to a public latrine. If not, you'd likely be using a chamber pot, essentially, a bucket in your bedroom that you'd have to empty yourself. And oh, that smell. It wasn't unusual for people to just toss their waste out the window, yes. You heard that right into the street or into a nearby river. This wasn't a world where sanitation and hygiene were priorities. So, let's travel back to these medieval times and explore just how they dealt with their bathroom breaks. Let's start with one of the most basic solutions, chamber pot. Now, before you think of it as some kind of quaint, dainty little object, let me assure you, it wasn't. These were often large, ceramic, or wooden pots that people would keep next to their beds ready for use during the night. The poor peasants, especially, had it rough. They didn't have the luxury of private rooms or even a designated place to do their business. They used the chamber pot, and once they were finished, someone had to empty it. And guess what? That someone was usually the same person who had been using it the night before. Imagine waking up in the morning to find that your chamber pot was overflowing, and now you're the one tasked with emptying it. Lovely, right? The rich weren't much better off, though their chamber pots may have been a bit more decorative. They still had the same problems. And to make matters worse, emptying the pots was often done in public, which was, let's say, less than ideal. So, what about those who lived in the cities? Surely, with all the hustle and bustle, they must have had more advanced systems in place for waste disposal. Well, not exactly. The public latrines were the next level of medieval bathroom technology, but they weren't much better. These were often large, communal toilets built into the side of the street or in public spaces. Picture a row of people, sitting next to each other, sharing the same space. And yep, you guessed it, relieving themselves into a common pit. The City of London, for example, had some of these public latrines scattered around, but they were nothing like the clean, private bathrooms we're used to. In fact, these public toilets were often just pits dug into the ground, and as you might imagine, they got really gross. There was no plumbing, no way to flush, and no way to keep the space clean. These latrines didn't have the luxury of fresh air or ventilation either. The smell was unbearable. Historians still argue whether the unsanitary conditions in public latrines contributed to the spread of diseases like the plague, though I think we all know the answer to that one. But let's zoom in on the really interesting part, the medieval cesspit. The cesspit, for those of you not familiar, was basically a large hole in the ground where people dumped all of their waste. It sounds unpleasant, right? Well, it was. But the cesspit had a certain functionality to it. You see, it wasn't just a random pit. It was often strategically placed beneath a structure, like a castle or a large building. Some castles had their own cesspits, which, while revolting, were a way of managing waste on a large scale. Imagine it, a huge pile of human waste, rotting beneath the castle floor. That's how things worked back then, basic sanitation, but at a very low standard. And even when these cesspits were filled, they weren't always emptied properly. Some of the waste would stay there for years, festering and leaking out, causing a whole host of problems. In fact, there's evidence that in some places, people would accidentally dig into a cesspit while constructing new buildings. Definitely a situation you wouldn't want to find yourself in. But you might be wondering, how did the wealthy avoid the horrors of chamber pots and cesspits? Well, in some cases, castles and monasteries came up with innovative, if not entirely clean, solutions. For instance, some castles featured what were known as garderobes, which were small, private rooms with a hole in the floor that led directly to a drop into the castle grounds or to the moat. Essentially, they were like the medieval equivalent of a modern-day outhouse, though not nearly as pleasant. The garderobe was the height of sophistication, but don't let that fool you no one was exactly happy about using them. And if you were in a castle, you might have had your own private chamber pot. But that wasn't always the case. The wealthiest people still had to rely on public latrines, or, if they were really lucky, a secluded privy. Historians still argue whether the use of garderobes and cesspits was an attempt at improving hygiene or whether it was just an attempt at getting rid of waste in any way possible. Either way, you can't deny that medieval toilets were an essential part of daily life, even if they were less than glamorous. So next time you flush your toilet, remember that it's a privilege, because those medieval toilets were certainly nothing to envy. Asterisk. Now that we've got the basics covered, let's step back in time and take a broader look at how medieval toilets evolved. The origins of these unsanitary systems actually trace back much further than the Middle Ages. Imagine you're back in the Roman Empire, where public toilets were actually somewhat advanced compared to what was about to come. Romans, for all their pomp and engineering prowess, had something that even many medieval towns lacked: proper plumbing. These ancient public latrines, often located in the heart of cities, were a social gathering spot, complete with running water to flush away waste. You'd be sitting side by side with your neighbors, perhaps chatting while doing your business. And while the sanitation may have been a step up from what we're used to thinking of with medieval toilets, it was still far from perfect. Historians still argue whether Roman toilets actually provided any significant benefit in terms of public health, or whether they were just a place for people to gossip, somewhat oblivious to the long-term consequences of poor hygiene. It wasn't until the collapse of the Roman Empire that Europe slipped backward into the so-called Dark Ages, where the concept of efficient waste disposal became a lost art for many centuries. This period marked a distinct decline in the quality of public sanitation, and the medieval world would continue to struggle with similar issues, sometimes with only minor improvements over time. So, let's flash forward a few centuries to the medieval period. It's the 12th century, and you're walking through a typical village or town in Europe. Castles, monasteries, and a few larger buildings in cities may have had access to some form of toilet. But for the average peasant, not so much. Most people still relied on chamber pots or simply went outside. In fact, many towns and villages had communal spots where everyone would go to do their business, often in plain sight, creating a strange sense of community around waste management. But the most interesting thing about medieval toilets is how varied they could be, especially when it came to the differences between the nobility and the peasantry. Nobles and wealthy individuals had access to more private and potentially even sophisticated facilities, while peasants were left to make do with whatever they could find. In larger towns and cities, public latrines began to emerge, usually in the form of communal pits or simple toilet rooms. Historians debate whether these public toilets were intended to be a convenience or just a necessary evil due to the lack of private spaces. Many of these latrines were open-air affairs, built into the side of buildings or along roadsides. Imagine a long bench with holes in it, and the waste would drop down into a pit below. One of the most fascinating things about these early latrines is how much the designs varied depending on where you were. Cities like London had a few public latrines set up for the population, while rural areas and smaller villages simply made do with a hole in the ground. These primitive toilets were essentially just pits dug into the earth, where waste would accumulate over time. Interestingly, the medieval world wasn't completely unaware of the need for waste disposal. It's just that they lacked the technology to make it cleaner or more efficient. Some of these latrines, especially in castles or monasteries, had crude plumbing systems that allowed the waste to be flushed away into nearby rivers or ditches. But often this system was far from effective, especially during the rainy season. The reality is that even the wealthiest individuals in the Middle Ages didn't have the luxury of clean, hygienic bathrooms, and they had to make do with what they had, which often meant bad smells and unseemly conditions. Now, let's zoom in on one of the most interesting aspects of medieval toileting, the cesspit. You've probably heard this term before, but you may not fully understand just how widespread these structures were. Cesspits were large, deep pits dug into the earth, often directly beneath buildings like castles or large homes. They served as the primary means of waste disposal for the medieval population. Essentially, the cesspit was the medieval version of a modern septic tank, though it was far less sanitary. Over time, waste would accumulate in these pits, creating a stench that would permeate through the surrounding areas. In some cases, the cesspit would overflow, leading to nasty situations in which human waste would spill into the streets or into the nearby water supply. Historians argue whether these cesspits were a practical solution for the time or just an unfortunate necessity. But there's no question that they played a central role in medieval waste management. Interestingly, cesspits were often located near the kitchen or other essential areas of a home or castle, meaning that the odor would sometimes waft right into the places where food was prepared. The medieval world didn't exactly have the best understanding of hygiene, and many people thought that bad smells were simply a part of life. Some people even believed that bad odors could cause disease, which may explain why so many people, rich and poor alike, seem to accept the filth and stench surrounding them. The lack of understanding about disease transmission also led to a different approach to waste management, with little concern for contamination or public health. In fact, many towns would simply let the cesspits fill up over time until they were completely overflowing, at which point they'd be emptied, sometimes in a very crude manner, to make room for more waste. But not all waste disposal in the medieval world was quite so straightforward. Some castles and large estates had more innovative systems for dealing with waste. For instance, castles often featured what was known as a garderobe. The garderobe was a small room with a hole in the floor that allowed waste to drop directly outside the building, into a pit, or even into the moat surrounding the castle. This was, in theory, a more private solution for nobles who could afford it. However, despite the seeming sophistication of the garderobe, it still left much to be desired. First off, not every castle had one, and those that did often had poor ventilation, making them even worse than some of the more basic latrines. Still, this development was a step forward in the medieval quest for privacy and hygiene by modern standards. It was hardly something to be envious of. Historians still argue whether the development of the garderobe was a reflection of the growing desire for privacy among the medieval elite, or simply an attempt to keep the waste out of sight. The reality is that these early systems, though somewhat inventive for their time, still didn't offer much in the way of comfort, hygiene, or sanitation. The lack of knowledge about disease prevention and waste management meant that these systems were less about providing clean solutions and more about simply moving waste out of sight. So, next time you're sitting on your modern toilet, flush away any thoughts of medieval methods, because while we've come a long way, the medieval world certainly didn't make it easy to deal with waste. As revolting as it sounds, the reality is that medieval toilets were a crucial part of daily life, and without them, society as we know it may not have been able to function at all. Let's step back in time once again, and this time, picture yourself in the heart of a medieval bedroom. The stone walls are cold, and the flickering light of a candle casts shadows across the small, humble space. You've just finished a long day's work, and as the evening settles in, your body starts to demand a bit of relief. But alas, there's no bathroom to retreat to, no porcelain throne, no soft toilet paper, no luxurious modern plumbing. Instead, you reach over and grab the chamber pot by your bedside. This simple ceramic or wooden vessel is what people in the Middle Ages used for their most private moments. And while it may sound simple enough, the reality of chamber pot use in medieval times was, well, less than ideal. Imagine it. This is your designated toilet, the very thing you'd have to rely on after a long day, maybe even in the middle of the night. It's a far cry from the comfort and privacy of today's modern facilities, and you may be wondering, how did people manage with such an uncomfortable and unsanitary solution? The chamber pot, for all its simplicity, was the solution to many medieval bathroom dilemmas, especially for those living in cramped or crowded conditions. It wasn't just a bucket-o, no. It was an essential part of medieval life, a tool that would remain by your bedside, used for its most basic function, night after night. Most people, particularly peasants and common folk, didn't have access to elaborate public latrines or fancy indoor plumbing, so the chamber pot became their most trusted companion. And while the wealthy may have enjoyed more privacy, their solution wasn't much better. Chamber pots were used by all levels of society. The main difference was that the rich might have had more decorative versions, sometimes made of fine porcelain or pottery, while the poor were stuck with simpler, perhaps less aesthetically pleasing versions. But let's take a step further back and look at the materials. Chamber pots were made from various substances, depending on the available resources. In some regions, ceramic pots were the preferred material, but wood and metal were also used in certain places. Imagine the medieval craftsmanship that went into these pieces, the way they were handmade, sometimes with intricate designs or even carvings. Yet, despite the care that went into making these pots, they were primarily built for function, not beauty. After all, you'd want something that could hold your waste, withstand the elements, and not crack easily. The chamber pot wasn't something to show off, it was a practical, albeit uncomfortable, solution. And of course, the pots had to be emptied eventually. That meant someone, usually the same person who used it, would have to dump the contents. But where did it go? For those in cities, it was often tossed out into the street. This wasn't just a one-off event. Chamber pots were emptied regularly, contributing to the unsanitary, stinky conditions in medieval towns and cities. Imagine, if you will, the unpleasant routine. At night, you use your chamber pot in the comfort of your room, away from prying eyes. The next morning, however, someone has to deal with the contents. In some homes, it was the servants or household staff who would dispose of the waste, but in many cases, it was up to the person who used it to dump it themselves. And where do you think it went? Straight out the window. Yes, that's right. In many cases, people would simply empty their chamber pots onto the street below. If you were in a more densely packed urban area, this might have meant that the street was filled with waste and unpleasant smells, making walking around in the morning a far less than pleasant experience. And this wasn't just the lower class. Nobles and royalty weren't exactly exempt from this practice. Even the most luxurious castles had to deal with waste in similarly unsanitary ways, though they might have been slightly more private about it. The practice of tossing waste into the street was a common practice, and the idea of public sanitation was still a distant dream. As unpleasant as this all sounds, it's important to understand that medieval people didn't have the knowledge we have today about hygiene and public health. For them, waste was simply a part of life that had to be dealt with in whatever way was available. While some wealthy homes might have had a more private space for disposing of their waste, the overall sanitation conditions in medieval society were dismal at best. Public health was an afterthought, and diseases spread easily in cities where waste disposal was more or less non-existent. Historians still debate whether the lack of sanitation was the primary cause of many of the plagues and diseases that ravaged medieval populations. One thing is for sure: the living in a medieval town was a much more dangerous experience when it came to disease than living in most modern cities, where sanitation and plumbing are taken for granted. But let's take a closer look at the chamber pot's role in medieval castles, where the aristocracy lived. Castles were not exactly havens of cleanliness, though they were often more private and comfortable than the homes of peasants. Many castles had a specific room, often referred to as the garderobe, dedicated to waste disposal. The garderobe was essentially a small, closet-like room with a hole in the floor. The waste would fall through this hole and into a pit below the castle. In some castles, this pit was located outside, sometimes even in the moat. The waste was often dropped directly into the water, which might seem like an ingenious system, but it was hardly hygienic. Still, it was a step up from the public latrines in the cities, and it gave the nobility a certain sense of privacy. These garderobes were a rare luxury in the medieval world, a glimpse into how the wealthy might have dealt with their bathroom needs. The contrast between the lives of the nobility and the peasants is striking when it comes to toilet facilities. While peasants struggled with chamber pots, sometimes even in their shared living spaces, the wealthy could afford more private, albeit still unsanitary, solutions. However, there was a shared understanding of the basic need for waste disposal. Everyone, regardless of their social class, had to face the same challenge: where do you put your waste? Whether it was a chamber pot, a communal latrine, or a garderobe, the solution was always the same: get rid of it. But as we know, getting rid of waste doesn't always mean it's gone for good. The waste had to go somewhere, and in the medieval world, it often ended up in the streets or, at best, in a cesspit, where it continued to fester. Now, I know this doesn't sound glamorous or even remotely pleasant, but in many ways, the chamber pot was a symbol of the medieval struggle against nature's calls. It was a practical solution, albeit a gross one, that allowed people to live relatively normal lives despite the overwhelming challenges they faced with waste management. You can't help but marvel at how far we've come since then. Modern plumbing and sanitation might seem like the most basic of luxuries, but it's only by looking back at the chamber pot that we truly understand how far we've come in making sure that our business stays out of sight and out of smell. Now that we've explored the basics of the medieval toilet situation and the humble chamber pot, it's time to get into something even more revolting: waste disposal. You've just used your chamber pot, and it's time to dump it. If you're a lucky noble, maybe you've got your own private garderobe to dump the contents of your chamber pot. But for the common folk, well, that was a different story. Imagine the scene: you finish your business, gather up your pot, and head out into the streets. The sun is barely rising, and the stench of urine and feces lingers in the air. You stand at your window, looking out at the street below, and then, without thinking twice, you toss the contents out onto the street. And you're not alone, everyone else is doing the same. This wasn't a one-time event. In medieval cities, this was a daily routine, and if you lived in a crowded urban area, you could imagine how awful the streets must have smelled. No sanitation services, no sewer systems, just people throwing waste into the streets without a second thought. In fact, this practice was so common that it became a norm in many parts of Europe during the medieval period. Historians still debate whether this constant exposure to waste and filth led to the widespread outbreaks of disease and plague during this time. But it's safe to say that the poor hygiene certainly didn't help matters. But let's zoom out a bit and look at how waste was managed beyond the chambers of individuals. Picture a city. Let's take medieval London as an example. The streets were filled with merchants, travelers, children playing, and animals roaming freely. Amidst all this chaos, waste had to go somewhere. And guess where it ended up? That's right in the middle of the streets. With no sewer system or sanitation infrastructure, the waste from chamber pots, latrines, and kitchens was simply dumped into the public thoroughfare. It wasn't uncommon for people to walk through ankle-deep filth, their boots splashing in the muck as they made their way to work, to the market, or even to church. Some cities tried to manage waste by setting up designated dumps, but even these systems were primitive at best. The waste was often allowed to pile up in certain areas until it could be carted off, sometimes not for weeks. In some places, the waste was even used as a fertilizer for crops. Historians still argue about whether this was a smart use of waste, or just a way to avoid the problem of dealing with it properly. in many ways. The medieval world had no concept of sanitation in the modern sense of the word. The focus wasn't on cleanliness or health. People simply didn't have the knowledge we take for granted today about how waste can contaminate water, spread disease, or cause long-term health problems. Even though some towns did have public latrines, these were often just open pits or wooden structures built over a hole in the ground. They weren't any cleaner than the streets. People would go about their daily lives trying to ignore the overwhelming smell of human waste. And when the latrines or cesspits became too full, the waste would often just spill over and seep into the surrounding area. What's worse, the same rivers that served as a source of drinking water were often used as a dumping ground for waste, creating the perfect environment for disease to spread. It wasn't until much later in history that people began to make the connection between waste disposal and disease prevention. But for the most part, medieval people were blissfully unaware of the health risks they were exposing themselves to by living in such unsanitary conditions. But it wasn't all bad. Some cities made attempts at improving their waste disposal systems. For example, in some parts of medieval Europe, waste would be channeled into rivers or ditches, away from populated areas, in a rudimentary form of plumbing. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. And in some larger castles, where the wealthy had a bit more control over their living space, they might have had a more advanced system for dealing with waste, such as a garderobe that emptied directly into a moat or an underground pit. Though not perfect by modern standards, these systems were a bit of an improvement over what the average person had access to. But still, no one really had a good understanding of how waste could affect the health of entire populations. And so, many people lived in constant filth and squalor. In fact, many towns and villages simply didn't have the space or resources to create proper sanitation systems. Historians still debate the extent to which poor sanitation contributed to the spread of diseases like the Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century. Let's talk about the cesspit for a moment, because that's where the waste from chamber pots and latrines often ended up. A cesspit was essentially a large, deep hole dug into the ground where human waste was deposited. These pits could be located just about anywhere, beneath a castle, outside a monastery, or even under a house. And as you can imagine, were not exactly pleasant places. The waste would accumulate over time, and the smell was absolutely unbearable. In some cases, the pits would overflow, causing waste to spill out into the streets or nearby water sources. Cesspits also attracted all sorts of vermin, including rats and insects, which would feed on the decaying waste. But they served a purpose, albeit a revolting one. They kept the waste contained, at least temporarily, and though they weren't a perfect solution, cesspits were a step forward compared to what had come before. Some castles even had a system for draining the cesspit once it became full, but in many cases, the waste was simply left to rot. Historians still debate whether cesspits were an effective solution to waste disposal or simply a necessary evil. In the medieval world, it's clear that they weren't the ideal system, but for the time, they served their purpose, albeit in a very unsanitary way. The problem, however, was that these cesspits were often built near water sources, like rivers or wells. This created an ideal breeding ground for diseases, as contaminated water could easily spread throughout the surrounding area. It wasn't until the development of modern plumbing and sewage systems in later centuries that people truly began to understand the importance of clean water and proper waste disposal. In the grand scheme of things, medieval waste disposal was a messy, unpleasant, and unsanitary affair. But it was the best they had at the time. Looking back, it's easy to see how far we've come in terms of hygiene and sanitation. But it's also a reminder of just how resilient humans can be. Despite the filth and discomfort of medieval life, people still managed to live, work, and thrive, though it wasn't always in the cleanest of conditions. So, next time you flush the toilet, remember how much better things are today. Let's continue our journey through the depths of medieval waste management, and this time we're diving into the infamous cesspit. The idea of a cesspit may not sound glamorous. It's a deep, foul-smelling hole dug into the ground, typically located just outside a building, or, if you were living in a castle, possibly beneath your very feet. You've probably heard the term before, but I bet you didn't realize just how central these disgusting pits were to medieval life. Whether you lived in a tiny cottage in the village or in the stone halls of a castle, everyone had to deal with waste. If you lived in a rural area, you might have gotten away with digging a simple pit out in the yard. However, in larger towns, cities, and castles, cesspits were absolutely vital to the waste disposal system. The lack thereof, to be honest. In many cases, these pits were dug directly under buildings and even under the very walls of castles. This made it possible to discreetly get rid of the waste, but it also meant that the smell could become unbearable. The waste would collect and rot over time, and as you can imagine, this created a significant health risk. Overflowing cesspits, especially those located too close to the living spaces, would spill out into the streets, contaminating water supplies and spreading disease. But back then, people didn't really understand how unsanitary this was. It was just part of life, and to some extent, the people of medieval Europe simply had to tolerate it. Historically, cesspits were simply seen as a necessary evil and unavoidable feature of medieval life. They were not the only solution to waste disposal, but for many people, they were the best option available. Of course, this didn't stop people from complaining. The stench of a cesspit was enough to make anyone gag. But there wasn't much that could be done. And while the rich may have had access to more private, and perhaps slightly cleaner, solutions like the garderobe or latrines, everyone still had to contend with the reality of dealing with human waste. In fact, it wasn't unusual for castles or large homes to have cesspits underneath their floors, usually in the cellars or basements. Imagine living in a castle and knowing that there was a massive pit filled with human waste directly beneath you. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Historians still argue whether these cesspits were considered the most efficient form of waste management at the time, or whether they were simply the best people could do with the resources available to them. Either way, it's clear that medieval people didn't have the benefit of modern sanitation knowledge, and so they had to make do. Now, if we're being completely honest, cesspits were not much better than the latrines or chamber pots used by peasants. Sure, they might have been a bit more private, but they weren't any cleaner. And as far as hygiene went, well, you can imagine the consequences. Diseases spread like wildfire in medieval Europe, especially when people lived in such close quarters with filth. The spread of the bubonic plague in the 14th century is a tragic example of how poor sanitation and the lack of proper waste disposal systems contributed to a massive loss of life. The rats and fleas that spread the disease thrived in these unsanitary environments, and the contamination of water supplies through cesspits only worsened the situation. Though people back then didn't understand the connection between sanitation and health, We can look back and see that the lack of proper waste disposal was a major contributing factor to the spread of many deadly diseases. But let's take a step back and look at how cesspits were actually built. The basic concept was simple: dig a hole and throw your waste into it. But the placement of these pits was crucial. Ideally, they were situated away from living spaces to minimize exposure to the smell. In castles, large estates, and monasteries, these cesspits were often built beneath the building or its courtyard. That way, the waste could fall directly into the pit without causing a huge mess. This also helped contain the waste, but it didn't exactly make the place smell better. In many cases, cesspits were built near water sources like rivers or wells without any regard for contamination. This was a common oversight in the medieval world, and the result was often devastating. Without a true understanding of hygiene and disease prevention, people simply didn't realize that their waste could be the source of sickness. Some castles, especially the larger ones, had relatively advanced waste disposal systems, well advanced for the time. These castles featured what were known as garderobes, which were essentially small closets or rooms with holes in the floor that led directly into a pit or into the surrounding landscape. These garderobes were meant to provide some degree of privacy for the castle's inhabitants while they relieved themselves. Though this was a small step up from the communal latrines, it wasn't exactly the kind of luxury we'd expect in a modern toilet. Imagine, if you will, sitting in a room with a hole in the floor and your waste falling into the pit beneath the castle. In some cases, the waste would fall into the moat surrounding the castle, while in others, it would simply sit there, festering and rotting. Some castles had a system of flushing or draining the waste, but that wasn't always the case. Many castles were forced to deal with the waste manually, emptying the cesspits when they became full, usually with a shovel and bucket. The idea of modern plumbing was still centuries away, and these early solutions, though somewhat innovative, were far from perfect. Historians still argue about whether these early privies and garderobes were a significant improvement over the traditional cesspit. Some view them as the first steps toward more modern waste disposal methods, while others believe they were just another form of medieval laziness. Either way, they represented an attempt to deal with an uncomfortable but necessary aspect of daily life. These systems, primitive as they were, laid the groundwork for the waste disposal innovations that would come centuries later. As unpleasant as it was, the cesspit was a crucial part of the medieval world. It was essential to the way people lived and worked, even if it was something most people would rather forget. And while we may look back on the cesspit with a certain level of disgust, it's important to remember that it was the best solution medieval people had at the time. Despite its unpleasantness, it was an essential part of daily life, and it helped keep the streets, at least somewhat, free of human waste. It was a stark reminder of how far we've come in terms of sanitation and hygiene, and how much more advanced our modern systems are compared to the methods used by our medieval ancestors. So, the next time you're grateful for your indoor plumbing and sewage systems, take a moment to think about those medieval cesspits. As unpleasant as they were, they represented the best waste management solution available, and they were an essential part of the medieval world. Alright, let's take a detour and move from the medieval castles to the bustling, often filthy streets of the towns and cities. Picture yourself now, walking through a medieval marketplace. It's the 14th century, and the hustle and bustle of everyday life is in full swing. The air is filled with the smells of roasting meat, fresh bread, and spices, but, of course, there's something else you can't ignore: the smell of waste. Yes, just beneath the surface of that vibrant marketplace, is the hidden truth of medieval life, the constant presence of human waste in public spaces. In fact, the public latrine was, for many people, their only option for bathroom needs. These were often large, communal latrines that were built into the side of roads or public squares. Imagine a long row of people sitting side by side, doing their business, as others walk by and continue with their daily tasks. If you think about it for a second, these communal toilets were a weird blend of social and functional spaces, where privacy was practically non-existent, and hygiene was, well, something of an afterthought. But let's dive deeper into the role of these public latrines, and you'll begin to see how they fit into the medieval way of life. Public latrines weren't just a place for people to relieve themselves, they were a kind of social gathering point. It wasn't uncommon for people to chat while they sat, making these early toilets something like a public water cooler. But while this might sound amusing, it highlights just how little regard medieval society had for the basic human need for privacy. These latrines were often constructed in the busiest parts of town, right by the market, near churches, and along main roads. Imagine walking through a medieval city and seeing people squatting side by side with no more privacy than if they were standing in a public square. And, of course, with this lack of privacy came a distinct lack of cleanliness. There was no plumbing, no flushing mechanism, just a simple hole in the ground, and the waste would fall into a large pit or a drainage system below. Many of these latrines were built directly over ditches or streams, which would carry away the waste, but that didn't necessarily mean it was gone. Often, the waste would simply pile up, creating an unsanitary environment that contributed to the spread of disease. Historians still argue about the extent to which public latrines helped propagate disease, especially during outbreaks like the plague. However, it's safe to say that the lack of sanitation certainly didn't help matters. If you were lucky enough to live in a larger town or city, you might have access to a public latrine. These communal facilities were often just a series of benches or holes where people could sit side by side. Picture it. You'd walk into a room, maybe with some semblance of a roof to offer a little bit of shelter from the elements, and there, you'd sit with several other people, sharing the same unpleasant task. The waste would fall directly into a pit below, and the whole thing would be left to fester. The smell was overwhelming, and privacy was, well, non-existent. You might even find yourself in a situation where the only way to gain a little privacy was to chat with your fellow toilet goers, trying to distract yourself from the unpleasantness of the situation. And don't even get me started on the sounds. The public latrine wasn't just a communal space in terms of people, it was also a space where all sorts of sounds, from splashes to grunts, could be heard in the background. This kind of social setting was considered entirely normal at the time, though it would be an unimaginable experience for us today. These public latrines weren't necessarily a permanent solution to the medieval waste problem, though. The medieval world, despite being highly creative in some ways, didn't have the means to create the kind of sanitary systems that we take for granted today. Public latrines were just the most available option for the time, and they weren't ideal by any stretch of the imagination. Some larger cities might have attempted to create more organized systems for handling waste, but even then, it was mostly a matter of dumping the waste into ditches or streams, with little regard for the long-term consequences. In some cases, the waste would be channeled into nearby rivers, a practice that led to widespread contamination and the rapid spread of disease. In fact, it's believed that some of the earliest outbreaks of diseases like cholera, were linked to the contamination of drinking water by human waste. Historians still debate whether the public latrines played a significant role in the transmission of disease, but it's clear that they didn't help. Without the knowledge of germs and sanitation, medieval people lived in a world where disease was rampant and hygiene was barely considered. But there was a small ray of hope for those lucky enough to live in wealthier households. Castles, for example, often had slightly more private solutions for waste disposal, such as garderobes. A garderobe was essentially a private room with a hole in the floor that would drop waste directly into a pit or into the castle's moat. This was a bit more private than the communal latrines of the towns, but it was still a far cry from the clean, well-maintained bathrooms we have today. The garderobe was an important part of the castle's waste management system, though it came with its own issues. For one, it was located in some of the most uncomfortable places in the castle. Some garderobes were located near the living quarters, or even right next to the kitchen. Imagine being close enough to the stench of waste while you're trying to prepare your meal. And like all medieval toilet solutions, it didn't come with any kind of plumbing system. Waste just dropped into the pit, and as with other methods, it would eventually overflow, creating more problems than it solved. But while public latrines and garderobes were available, there were still vast segments of society that lived without any kind of waste management at all. For the poorest in the medieval world, chamber pots were their only option. These simple, portable vessels were used for both urination and defecation and had to be emptied regularly. And just like the rest of medieval waste disposal, the chamber pot wasn't exactly a clean solution. Many people would simply toss the contents out their windows or into the streets. In larger towns, the streets were often filled with human waste, making it incredibly unpleasant to walk around. It's not hard to see how medieval towns would have been incredibly unsanitary places to live in, especially with the absence of proper waste management systems. These public latrines, although necessary, were just another part of the filthy and unhygienic medieval landscape. Historians still argue whether medieval public latrines were a public health disaster or a temporary solution to the problem of waste disposal. Some believe that these latrines, though unsanitary by modern standards, helped prevent worse problems like open defecation in the streets. However, one thing is for sure, these latrines were far from ideal, and the lack of proper sanitation in medieval towns and cities contributed to many of the health issues that plagued the population. While the public latrines of medieval times served a purpose, they also showcased the many challenges that came with living in a pre-modern world, without the luxury of modern plumbing, clean water, and sanitation. Now that we've dived into the communal experience of using public latrines and how waste was disposed of on a grand scale, it's time to shift our focus to something that was as important as it was often neglected: hygiene. If you've ever wondered what it was like to live in a medieval town, you may be surprised to learn that, despite the lack of modern plumbing and sanitation, people in the Middle Ages didn't completely neglect cleanliness. But don't get too comfortable, because medieval hygiene practices weren't exactly what we would consider clean by today's standards. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. In many ways, medieval Europeans had a complicated relationship with personal cleanliness. While the idea of a daily shower or bath was not common, thankfully, we've evolved from that. Public bathhouses were once a central feature in the cities and towns of medieval Europe. These bathhouses were communal spaces, often quite large, where people would gather to wash, relax, and socialize. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was a social activity, a time to unwind, and often a place to discuss the latest news or gossip. People didn't use soaps in the same way we do today. Instead, they relied on simple water and sometimes herbs, oils, or even ash to cleanse themselves. Some historians still argue whether these bathhouses were beneficial to public health or whether they helped spread diseases like the plague, which seemed to target densely populated places. But one thing is certain: these bathhouses were among the few places where medieval people could attempt to clean themselves, albeit imperfectly. Despite their popularity in cities, bathhouses started to fall out of favor by the late medieval period. Several factors contributed to their decline, including fears about hygiene, the spread of disease, and religious beliefs. The church, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, began to discourage bathing, associating it with immoral behavior. The fear was that bathhouses were breeding grounds for not only physical illness but also sinful activities. The once popular bathhouses began to close down, and people became more likely to avoid regular bathing altogether. It's fascinating that while we may think of the Middle Ages as a time of barbarism and poor hygiene, the reality was much more nuanced. For some people, at least, the practice of bathing and washing in public bathhouses was a relatively frequent activity. However, for the vast majority of the population, washing became less about cleaning the body and more about simply surviving. So, what did medieval people use to keep themselves clean if they weren't bathing regularly? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. They used rags, sponges, and other primitive tools. After doing their business, they would often use whatever materials they had on hand: leaves, cloth, or even scraps of animal fur. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't exist. In fact, some medieval texts mention that people would use the wool from sheep or small pieces of fabric to wipe themselves. Others may have used straw or even communal sponges on sticks. Again, much like public latrines, privacy wasn't much of a consideration. Sharing a sponge or a piece of cloth among people was common, especially for those who couldn't afford more expensive alternatives. What's even more surprising is that medieval people didn't really understand germs, bacteria, or disease transmission. They had no idea that poor hygiene could lead to outbreaks of illnesses, especially with the use of communal sponges. This is why diseases like the plague were so devastating. They spread quickly in crowded, unsanitary environments. Now, let's talk about personal grooming in general. Medieval people weren't all that keen on keeping up with the cleanliness of their hair, face, or bodies. Bathing might have been infrequent, but combing hair and trimming beards was still part of daily life. Both men and women used various oils and herbs to keep their hair somewhat presentable, but there wasn't any sort of shampoo as we know it today. Instead, people often used mixtures of water, herbs, and even animal fats to cleanse their hair. For the nobility, perfumes and scented oils were common. But for the lower classes, hygiene was often a luxury they couldn't afford. In fact, the lack of cleanliness and the pervasive smells of body odor were significant enough that medieval people began using scented powders, oils, and perfumes to mask the stench. One of the most infamous smells of medieval life was the odor of human waste, and no amount of perfume could truly cover that up. Still, despite the strong smells, people did make an effort to smell as pleasant as they could, even if it wasn't as effective as we might hope. The concept of cleanliness extended beyond just the body. People in the Middle Ages were often surrounded by dirt and filth, not just in the streets, but also in their homes. Imagine living in a small stone house with a thatched roof. Inside, there would be straw or rushes on the floor, which would collect dust, food scraps, and yes, even waste. The wealthier households might have had stone floors, but even then, keeping things clean was a constant struggle. In many cases, the floors of houses, especially in rural areas, weren't swept regularly. Some homes had large hearths in the center of the room where the family gathered, but the smoke and soot from the fire would settle on everything. The dirtiness of medieval homes was a part of everyday life, and the constant presence of dust, dirt, and waste was just a fact of living in the pre-modern world. This is why the smell of human waste permeated everything. It wasn't just the public latrines or cesspits that contributed to the unpleasant stench. Everything, from the clothes to the furniture, had a sort of layer of grime on it. When you think about it, the idea of personal cleanliness takes on a different meaning in the context of the Middle Ages. People weren't necessarily filthy. They were just living in a world where hygiene was secondary to survival. Historians still argue whether medieval hygiene practices were actually worse than those of earlier civilizations, like the Romans or Egyptians. Some believe that medieval people were more advanced than we think, while others argue that the lack of bathing and basic sanitation practices led to a public health crisis. It's hard to say for sure, but it's clear that the medieval world struggled with cleanliness, especially when compared to the standards we have today. Still, people did try, in their own ways, to maintain some level of personal hygiene, whether it was through the use of communal sponges, herbs, or perfumes. The question, though, is whether these efforts were enough to keep medieval populations healthy and free from disease. So, next time you step into the shower or use the soap that's readily available in your home, remember that medieval people didn't have the same luxury. Their hygiene practices were a mix of effort and necessity, a far cry from the conveniences we take for granted today. While the people of the Middle Ages did what they could, their understanding of cleanliness and disease was limited, and that's why their world, at least in terms of sanitation, was so much different from ours. Now, let's step into the world of the wealthy during the medieval period and explore what castle life looked like when it came to toilets. While the peasants were battling chamber pots and public latrines, the nobility had a little more luxury when it came to managing their bodily needs. Castles, despite being the epitome of wealth and status, weren't exactly paragons of hygiene. The medieval castle, with its towering stone walls, turrets, and great halls, may have looked imposing, but inside, the aristocracy still had to deal with the same human necessities as everyone else, just with a bit more privacy, or so they thought. Castles were built to protect, not to provide the comforts we take for granted today, and that included waste disposal. In the case of castles, they did have a unique system for handling the problem of waste. The famous This was the closest thing to a toilet for the elite, and it offered a certain degree of privacy. Unlike the open air, public latrines in towns, the garderobe was a small room, often located in a corner of the castle, with a hole in the floor that allowed waste to fall directly into a pit, moat, or even the open air. If you were lucky enough to be a noble living in a large castle, this was about as good as it got in terms of bathroom facilities. However, don't be fooled into thinking that these garderobes were all glamorous and well maintained. The concept behind them was simple, though not particularly effective by modern standards. A small space for personal use with a direct drop to the outside. It's hard to imagine the inconvenience of such an arrangement. You'd be sitting in a room, perhaps in the dead of winter, with cold stone walls around you, and waste falling straight to the ground below. Some castles featured more sophisticated garderobes, where the waste would fall into a moat, and others might even have attempted some primitive form of drainage system to whisk away the waste. But, just like in the rest of the medieval world, hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. In fact, many of these garderobes were not only poorly ventilated, but were also located in close proximity to the castle's living spaces. Some garderobes, to make matters worse, were near the kitchens or other places where food was prepared. The smell of waste from these garderobes must have been truly unbearable. The waste would fester, creating an awful stench that wafted through the castle, perhaps even seeping into the nearby halls where meals were served. Still, for the aristocracy, the garderobe was a step above the chamber pot. It was more private, and it meant that the noble class didn't have to venture out into the crowded streets to use the public latrines. But just because they had access to better facilities didn't mean the rich were living in comfort when it came to waste management. While there was a slight upgrade in privacy, the overall cleanliness of these toilets was still abysmal. And the surrounding conditions, as you can imagine, were often no better than what the peasants dealt with. The worst part about these garderobes was how poorly they were maintained. Imagine a scenario where the waste kept piling up in the moat or in the pit under the castle, eventually overflowing and contaminating the surrounding areas. What's worse, these same castles didn't have an effective way to drain the waste out in a controlled manner. It was often simply left to rot, adding to the general unpleasantness of castle life. Interestingly, there were some castles that actually took a more creative approach to dealing with waste. The larger, more affluent estates sometimes included a more elaborate drainage system that tried to move waste away from the central living areas. Some castles had small trenches or channels that directed waste into nearby fields or waterways, hoping to keep the living quarters from being too impacted by the mess. These early attempts at a more organized waste management system were far from perfect, but they represented an early attempt at solving the waste problem in a more structured way. However, these drainage systems were often inadequate, and most castles still relied on cesspits, garderobes, and crude pit systems. Even when these systems worked somewhat, they were still a far cry from the kind of sanitation systems we rely on today. In the grand scheme of things, even though castles were built to represent wealth and power, the reality of waste management in these monumental structures was a messy, smelly affair. As unpleasant as it was, the castle toilet systems were still a significant improvement over the rudimentary latrines used by peasants in the villages. However, even the nobility's efforts at waste disposal were overshadowed by the lack of understanding of hygiene and disease in medieval society. People simply didn't know how waste impacted public health or the ways in which disease spread. The idea of sanitation was, at best, an afterthought, and even those living in castles were not safe from the deadly effects of poor hygiene. Waste would often contaminate water supplies, and the proximity of castles to rivers and streams only contributed to the spread of diseases like cholera and the plague. It's incredible, when you think about it, how waste disposal in castles, despite all their grandeur, was often just as unsanitary as anything found in the poorest quarters of the village. Historians still argue whether the castle's attempts at waste management were innovative for their time or simply a stopgap measure, one that barely solved the problem of human waste disposal. On one hand, the garderobe represented a small improvement over other forms of waste disposal. It provided a measure of privacy and the idea of waste being disposed of in a single location, however crude. On the other hand, it also highlighted the lack of hygiene knowledge in medieval times. as castles, no matter how grand, were still not immune to the dangers of unsanitary practices. The waste from the garderobe often ended up in the same places that sewage from public latrines went, into nearby water sources or directly into the environment. The idea of keeping waste separated from human habitation, let alone keeping it clean, was still a concept far in the future. It's also fascinating to consider the fact that many of these castles were built in such a way that waste had to be dealt with in whatever way was available. Castles were designed to withstand attacks, not to prioritize hygiene. As a result, the nobility had to make do with whatever solutions they could find. The garderobe, though a step up from the chamber pot, was still a relatively primitive solution. The real sanitary revolution came centuries later, as public awareness about the link between sanitation and health grew. For the time, the castle toilet systems were an indication of the medieval struggle to balance comfort, privacy, and cleanliness, and they were a far cry from the modern standards we expect today. But looking back at these systems, it's easy to see how the development of waste management evolved over time, and how the practices of the past laid the groundwork for the sanitation systems we take for granted today. Now that we've explored the challenges and systems of waste management for both peasants and the nobility, let's zoom out a little and consider how medieval society as a whole approached the divide between the elite and the common folk when it came to toilets. You might think that the upper class had a much easier time dealing with the basic necessities of life. But when it comes to medieval toilets, it wasn't exactly an easy life for anyone, no matter your social status. The differences, however, were striking. The wealthy had access to private facilities, like the garderobe, a more personal solution, but for the peasants, it was often about sheer survival. Imagine being one of the lower class, waking up in your cramped, dark home, likely shared with several other family members. There's no castle with a grand garderobe, for you no noble toilet to retreat to. For peasants, using the chamber pot was the norm, and for many, emptying it wasn't just a weekly chore, but a daily one. After the morning routine, you'd step outside and hurl the contents of your chamber pot into the street or out the window, letting the contents mix with the waste of your neighbors. While the wealthier classes could afford more privacy in their waste disposal, they were still limited by the lack of knowledge about hygiene and disease prevention. Whether you were a noble or a commoner, the medieval world offered few real solutions for sanitation. The real disparity between the rich and poor came in the form of physical space and convenience. Castles were usually built in large, sprawling compounds with separate rooms for various needs, but for peasants, life was cramped, and personal space was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. Many medieval peasants lived in small, single-room homes that were shared with animals, and there was no privacy whatsoever when it came to using the bathroom. Chamber pots were often kept in corners or under the bed, with little more than a curtain or a piece of cloth to offer some semblance of privacy. This was the daily reality for most people, and it speaks volumes about the stark contrast between the lives of the wealthy and the poor. The people in castles could, at least, have their own private garderobe, while the common folk had no such luxury. They had to make do with what was available, whether that meant using a communal latrine, a public pit, or their chamber pot. However, the aristocracy didn't have it entirely easy either. Though they may have enjoyed private facilities, they were still subject to the same basic challenges as everyone else. Castles, despite their grandeur, were not immune to the discomforts of medieval life. While the garderobe might offer some privacy, it didn't shield the wealthy from the overwhelming smells of waste that permeated the air. Imagine spending time in the hallways of a castle, only to be greeted by the unmistakable stench of human waste drifting from the garderobe or the cesspit below. The waste might have been out of sight, but the smells were anything but out of mind. The same held true for those living near public latrines in the cities. Though the nobility may have had better accommodations, they were still within a world that lacked the modern conveniences and cleanliness we expect today. There was no escape from the pungent realities of medieval sanitation, whether you lived in a village or a castle. So, while the wealthier people in the medieval world did have a certain amount of comfort and privacy when it came to their bathroom needs, they were still subject to the same underlying issues of sanitation. The methods of waste disposal, whether chamber pots or garderobes, were crude by modern standards. For the common folk, the situation was far worse. With little privacy and minimal access to even the rudimentary sanitation systems in place, there was no sanitation infrastructure like we have today, no underground sewers, no plumbing, and no real understanding of how to properly manage waste to ensure public health. The commoners might have had to deal with communal latrines or toss their chamber pot contents into the street. But the aristocracy wasn't living in much better conditions. Castles, despite their towering stone walls and majestic halls, often smelled just as bad as the villages they looked down upon. Castles, like all medieval structures, were designed for defense, not comfort. Sanitation was simply an afterthought. It was a world where public health was not a priority, and both the rich and the poor had to contend with a lack of cleanliness that would be unimaginable in the modern era. This stark contrast between the wealthy and the poor when it came to toilets was not just about privacy, was about access to resources, space, and knowledge. The wealthy had more room to build private facilities, but they still suffered from poor waste management. And while the common folk had to live in overcrowded conditions with little access to waste disposal systems, they didn't have the luxury of privacy. The debate between the two classes in medieval society wasn't just about material wealth. It extended to the most basic human needs, like where you went to the bathroom and how you disposed of waste. The reality was that no one, regardless of class, had access to the sanitation systems that we take for granted today. Historians continue to discuss the relationship between wealth and sanitation in the medieval period. Did the wealthy enjoy significantly better waste management systems than the common folk? It's easy to assume so, but the truth is that both classes struggled with waste in different ways. The nobility may have had access to private garderobes and a more exclusive way of managing waste, but they weren't free from the overwhelming smell of human waste that was everywhere, whether in castles or nearby latrines. The poor were left with the less than ideal public latrines, or the need to empty their chamber pots into the streets. But they too lived in a world where sanitation was a distant dream. The real difference between the two classes wasn't just in the toilet facilities. Didn't have clean water or effective waste disposal. In fact, no one really did. People of all classes shared the same unsanitary conditions, and diseases spread across the land, especially in places where waste management was non-existent. It wasn't until the Renaissance and beyond that more modern approaches to public health and waste management were developed. Until then, both the nobility and the common people had to make do with crude, inefficient solutions. The medieval toilet systems, whether for the rich or the poor, as a reminder of the many obstacles people faced in maintaining basic hygiene in a world without the knowledge or technology we now take for granted. Let's take a moment to focus on perhaps one of the most memorable aspects of medieval toilets. The smell, yes, the overwhelming, ever-present stench that accompanied any form of waste disposal during the medieval period. The smells of medieval life were as much a part of daily experience as the clanging of blacksmiths' hammers or the cries of street vendors selling bread and fish. But unlike the other sounds and sights of medieval life, the smell of waste was pervasive, lingering, and impossible to ignore. Imagine walking through the narrow, cobbled streets of a medieval town, the air thick with the odor of rotting food, animal waste, and human refuse. The medieval city was, in many ways, a giant open-air cesspit, with waste piling up on street corners and in rivers, creating a fog of unpleasant smells that enveloped the entire urban environment. And as much as medieval people tried to avoid it, they couldn't escape the stink. The problem wasn't just confined to the lower classes. The rich, living in their grand castles, may have had more privacy and slightly better waste disposal systems, but they weren't immune to the smell. In fact, they were often right in the thick of it. The waste produced in garderobes and cesspits would seep into the surrounding areas, creating a stench that wafted through the castle halls and lingered in the courtyards. The presence of waste was unavoidable. For anyone living in medieval times, it was a constant companion. But why was the smell so bad? Let's start with a simple fact that medieval waste management systems were woefully inadequate. There was no modern plumbing, no sewage system to carry waste away, and certainly no treatment plants to clean the water. What was left was essentially a constant cycle of waste accumulating in cesspits, ditches, and streets. When you think about it, you might assume that a simple system of waste disposal should have been a priority for any society. But medieval Europe didn't have that luxury. The lack of understanding about germs, bacteria, and disease meant that waste management wasn't viewed through a lens of hygiene and health. To medieval people, waste wasn't seen as something that needed to be treated, was simply something that needed to be disposed of. Whether it was thrown into the streets or dumped into a cesspit, there was no real consideration for how waste might affect the overall cleanliness of the environment. The smell of human waste was therefore a natural consequence of this lack of planning. This stench didn't just come from the places where people directly relieved themselves. It spread everywhere. Towns and villages, with their cramped quarters, didn't have the space to properly handle waste. So, the waste was discarded wherever there was room, often directly into the streets, or in some cases, into nearby rivers. These rivers, which in some cases served as both a water source and a waste disposal site, became the breeding grounds for disease. The unpleasant smells were a symptom of something far worse, the unspoken reality that unsanitary conditions created an environment ripe for disease. Medieval towns often had no proper drainage, which meant that water and waste mixed freely, making it easy for water supplies to become contaminated. The consequences of this were catastrophic. In times of outbreaks like the Black Death, the density of the population combined with unsanitary conditions contributed directly to the spread of disease. The poor conditions of medieval toilets, cesspits, and latrines were not just a nuisance. They were a matter of life and death. Historians still debate the link between sanitation and the spread of disease in the medieval period, but it's hard to ignore the correlation. The overwhelming stench of human waste wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a direct reflection of the deep-rooted health problems facing medieval societies. People in cities, especially, lived surrounded by this smell. and in the absence of effective waste disposal, the poor hygiene led to the spread of diseases like cholera, typhoid, and, of course, the plague. The combination of rotting waste, overcrowding, and poor living conditions created the perfect storm for outbreaks. Public latrines, communal toilets, and even the more private garderobes didn't solve the underlying issues. Waste still had to be disposed of, and when it wasn't properly handled, it became a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. You can imagine the frustration of the common folk who had to deal with the stench daily, while the wealthy were often more shielded from the immediate impacts. But even they weren't immune to the smell that pervaded the air around them. One of the peculiarities of medieval life, especially in towns and cities, was the complete lack of infrastructure to manage waste effectively. The rich may have been able to retreat to their private garderobes, but the waste from these facilities often had no real outlet. Even the advanced castles, with their moat disposal systems, still faced significant sanitation issues. There was no system in place to truly clean the waste or remove it from the ecosystem. The waste just piled up, often in cesspits or in the moats of castles, eventually seeping into the environment. Some castles did attempt to use waste as fertilizer, which, in theory, could have been a smart use of organic material. However, this system was far from foolproof and, more often than not, simply added to the pervasive smell. The smell of human waste was unavoidable, no matter how much people tried to separate their personal needs from the public sphere. It was a constant reminder of the limitations of medieval waste management. Historians have pointed out that the use of perfumes, scented oils, and other fragrant substances in medieval times may have been a way to mask the unpleasant odors of waste. It wasn't uncommon for people, particularly the upper class, to dab a little perfume on themselves in an attempt to counteract the overwhelming smells of both their surroundings and their own bodies. In fact, the rise of perfume in Europe in the late Middle Ages can be linked, at least in part, to the need to cover up the constant stench of unsanitary conditions. The idea of perfume as a way to mask unpleasant odors became entrenched in European culture. And while it was often seen as a luxury for the wealthy, it became one of the few ways to cope with the unbearable reality of medieval smells. Yet, despite all these efforts, the medieval world never truly escaped the smell of waste. Public hygiene was a luxury, and it was a luxury that few could afford. The rich, while they may have had slightly more private facilities, still lived in a world that was heavily influenced by the stench of human refuse. The poor, of course, had it worse, living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions where the smells were impossible to avoid. The smell of waste wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an ever-present reminder of how far humanity had to go before sanitation could be considered a priority. And, as we now know, it would take centuries before plumbing, sewage systems, and modern waste management would emerge, making our world much cleaner and much less smelly than the medieval one. Now that we've covered the basic challenges, the smells, and the rudimentary waste disposal systems of medieval life, let's shift our focus to some of the early attempts at innovation when it came to toilets and sanitation. Despite the lack of modern plumbing or effective waste management systems, people in the medieval period did try to develop more efficient ways to handle human waste, especially in places like castles, monasteries, and larger towns. These early innovations, though crude by today's standards, were important steps in the evolution of sanitation, paving the way for the systems we use now. One of the most interesting innovations was the use of privies, or private latrines, in some of the larger buildings. Unlike the public latrines that were built for the masses, privies were built to provide a bit more privacy and separation from the communal experience of relieving oneself. While not necessarily a luxury, the privy was an attempt to create a more personal space, offering a little more dignity to the user. In larger castles and estates, these privies were often part of a complex system that tried to isolate waste from living spaces, even though, in practice, the waste often just ended up in cesspits or nearby rivers. Nonetheless, the idea of having a more private, contained space for waste management was an early innovation that contributed to the eventual development of more sophisticated toilets and sewage systems. Some of the best examples of early innovations in medieval toilets were found in monasteries, where the need for sanitation was more critical due to the communal living arrangements of monks. Monasteries, unlike typical homes, had large communities of people living in close quarters, and they often faced significant challenges when it came to managing waste. The idea of creating a latrine that could serve multiple people in an organized, private way began to take shape here. Monasteries often constructed special areas for waste, with some even developing early forms of water management to move waste away from the living spaces. Some of these latrines were located near running water, and in some cases, they used basic plumbing to carry waste out of the building and into nearby streams or ditches. This was a significant improvement over the open cesspits and streets of the towns, where waste simply piled up. The religious and philosophical importance of cleanliness in these communities, though not fully understood in terms of health, led to better waste management practices in monasteries compared to other areas of medieval society. Even though these systems were still rudimentary, they laid the groundwork for the more effective sanitation practices that would emerge in later centuries. However, even with these early efforts, there was still no unified approach to waste management. Across medieval Europe, there was no general understanding of the role that waste disposal played in maintaining public health. Communities were isolated from each other, and the lack of centralized systems meant that innovation in sanitation was often limited to individual buildings or estates. This was a time before plumbing and advanced sewage systems. So much of what we consider basic sanitation today had to wait until the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods for serious developments. That said, some cities began to experiment with ways to improve their waste management, though these efforts were usually limited and uneven. In places like Paris, there were attempts to organize waste disposal, but the systems were still rudimentary, and waste often ended up in nearby rivers or open pits. The lack of a true understanding of disease transmission meant that these early innovations were still only half solutions. People didn't yet grasp that human waste could contaminate drinking water and lead to the spread of disease. Still, these early attempts at waste management were critical moments in history, and they laid the foundation for future developments in sanitation that would become more sophisticated over time. In addition to privies and latrines, another interesting, albeit strange, solution for medieval waste was the concept of night soil. Night soil was a term used to describe the human waste that accumulated in chamber pots overnight. The waste would then be collected in the morning and either thrown into the streets or taken to cesspits. But for cities and towns with larger populations, this method became increasingly problematic. With no system to properly manage waste, the streets would become filled with refuse, leading to the spread of disease. However, in some cities, people attempted to collect the night soil for other purposes. The waste, being rich in organic matter, was sometimes used as fertilizer for crops, especially in rural areas. The concept of night soil being repurposed for agriculture might seem strange, but it was one of the few ways that human waste was put to use in medieval Europe. In fact, this idea of using waste as fertilizer persisted for centuries and is still used today in some parts of the world, albeit in a much more regulated and sanitary way. It's fascinating to think that this was a time when waste was seen less as something to be discarded and more as something that had potential value, though it was certainly not the cleanest or most efficient method of recycling. Despite all these innovations, it's clear that medieval sanitation systems were far from effective. The reliance on cesspits, chamber pots, and communal latrines left people vulnerable to the spread of disease, and the overall lack of hygiene created an environment in which epidemics could thrive. During the Black Death in the 14th century, for instance, the lack of proper sanitation played a significant role in the devastating death toll. The unsanitary conditions in cities and towns, combined with overcrowding and poor waste disposal, made it easy for diseases like the plague to spread rapidly. People were living in close proximity to waste, and in many cases, their drinking water was contaminated by sewage. This created a deadly cycle in which poor sanitation led to the spread of disease, which in turn made sanitation even more difficult to improve. The medieval world was stuck in this cycle, and it wasn't until the Renaissance and later centuries that people began to develop more sophisticated solutions to waste disposal and hygiene. While the lack of modern sanitation was undoubtedly one of the major public health challenges of the medieval period, it's important to acknowledge the ingenuity that people displayed in trying to solve these problems. From the creation of privies and latrines in castles and monasteries to the use of night soil as fertilizer, medieval people were attempting to make the best of a difficult situation. The systems they put in place were crude and often ineffective, but they marked the beginning of a slow evolution toward more advanced waste management practices. The fact that these systems even existed, despite their imperfections, is a testament to the human drive for progress and innovation, even in the most challenging of times. Today, when we take a moment to flush our toilets, let's remember that these modern conveniences came from centuries of trial and error, from people who faced the same basic human needs, but didn't have the resources or knowledge to address them in the way we do today. Now that we've explored the early innovations and challenges surrounding waste disposal in the medieval period, let's take a look at how these unsanitary conditions actually shaped the development of towns and cities during this time. You might think that waste management was a secondary concern in the grand scheme of medieval urban planning, but in reality, the presence or absence of proper sanitation systems had a huge impact on how medieval cities were designed, built, and maintained. Picture yourself walking through the narrow streets of a medieval town, with buildings crowded together and market stalls spilling into the roads. The air is thick with the sounds of vendors shouting, horses trotting by, and children playing. But there's something else, something you can't ignore. The smell. Yes, the constant presence of waste in these urban areas was a direct result of poor sanitation infrastructure, and this waste was often dumped directly into the streets, left to fester and rot. The design of medieval towns reflected this reality. Streets weren't built with cleanliness in mind, they were often winding, narrow, and overcrowded, with no designated space for waste disposal. What you had, instead, were small open-air sewers that could barely manage the constant influx of human waste. The lack of planning for waste disposal in medieval cities was due, in part, to the lack of knowledge about hygiene and disease transmission. People didn't fully understand the link between unsanitary conditions and the spread of disease, which meant that waste was often dealt with haphazardly. In some cases, cities like Paris had rudimentary drainage systems, but these were usually ineffective and inadequate for the needs of the growing population. As cities became more populated, the problem of waste disposal only worsened. Towns and cities that had no formal sanitation systems found themselves with streets filled with human waste, rotting food, and filth, which only added to the general unpleasantness of city life. In some cases, city planners tried to dig ditches to channel waste away from residential areas, but these makeshift sewers were often overwhelmed and ineffective. Historians still argue over whether the early attempts at waste management were a sign of urban innovation or simply an afterthought that only created more problems in the long run. Interestingly, while the streets of medieval cities were often unsanitary and filled with waste, there was also an understanding, albeit primitive, of how to deal with waste in the form of cesspits. These cesspits were large, deep holes dug into the ground where waste from both public latrines and chamber pots was deposited. In some ways, the cesspit was an early solution to the growing waste problem. By burying waste in the ground, people thought they could contain the filth and avoid having it spread throughout the streets. However, this practice had its own issues. Many cities simply didn't have the space for cesspits, and those that did often placed them too close to water supplies, causing contamination of drinking water. In fact, the widespread use of cesspits, combined with the lack of knowledge about disease transmission, contributed significantly to the spread of diseases like cholera and typhoid in medieval cities. The fact that waste was often disposed of in close proximity to water sources meant that the risk of contamination was high. But despite these risks, cesspits were still the go-to solution for most medieval towns, as there were no better alternatives at the time. These early attempts at waste disposal are a reflection of the trial-and-error nature of medieval society. Innovations that were born out of necessity, but often failed to address the root causes of unsanitary conditions. The challenge of waste disposal in medieval cities wasn't just about hygiene, it was about urban development itself. As towns grew, waste became a larger and more pressing issue. Without proper sanitation systems, urban centers became breeding grounds for disease. One of the reasons cities like London, Paris, and Florence faced such high mortality rates in the medieval period was their inability to deal with the waste produced by rapidly growing populations. In these cities, the development of infrastructures, as public latrines, sewage systems, and waste disposal facilities lagged far behind the demands of an increasing urban population. The streets were overcrowded with waste, and the lack of clean water only exacerbated the problem. While the nobility could retreat to their castles and estates, where waste was more contained, the poor were left to live in the filth of the streets, where disease ran rampant. This gap in living conditions between the rich and poor was particularly pronounced when it came to sanitation. The wealthier classes could afford more private latrines and garderobes, but the poor were left to deal with the challenges of living in unsanitary conditions. This stark division created a social divide, where the urban poor were more vulnerable to disease outbreaks, while the aristocracy remained relatively sheltered. Interestingly, as cities began to develop and expand, the need for better waste management systems became increasingly apparent. The growing population of urban areas made it clear that something had to be done to address the problem of waste disposal. But while cities like Paris, London, and Florence were among the first to attempt To regulate waste management, they were still far behind in terms of effective sanitation infrastructure. It wasn't until the Renaissance and the Enlightenment periods that more advanced methods of waste management began to take shape. With the advent of new technologies and a better understanding of public health, cities began to build more sophisticated sewer systems that could carry waste away from populated areas. However, these advancements didn't come overnight. They were the result of centuries of trial and error. From the earliest cesspits to the development of rudimentary plumbing systems. In fact, the development of sanitation systems was a slow and difficult process that spanned many centuries. The modern sewage and plumbing systems that we take for granted today were only developed much later in history. The transformation of waste management from crude cesspits and public latrines to the efficient, clean systems we have now didn't happen until the 19th century. It was during the Industrial Revolution, with the rise of modern cities and the spread of disease, that the need for proper sewage systems became critical. The idea of public health, including the role of sanitation in preventing disease, became a driving force behind the development of modern plumbing. Cities began to invest in large-scale sewer systems that could carry waste away from residential areas and into treatment plants. This marked a major turning point in the history of sanitation and hygiene, and it was the culmination of centuries of experimentation, failure, and progress. Despite all of the challenges and limitations of medieval waste disposal, it's important to recognize that these early systems were essential in laying the groundwork for the modern sanitation systems we have today. The trial and error process of developing better waste management techniques was an important part of urban development, and it showed that humans, even in the most unsanitary of times, were capable of finding creative solutions to the problems they faced. It also demonstrated the deep connection between sanitation and public health, something that would become increasingly important in the centuries to come. So, while medieval toilets may not have been as clean or efficient as what we use today, they were a critical part of the evolution of urban planning and waste management, and they played a key role in shaping the cities of the future. Having explored the early innovations and urban developments related to medieval waste disposal, it's essential to shift our focus now to how toilets and waste management systems impacted the daily lives of people. You might be thinking, how does something as mundane as waste affect daily life beyond the obvious? Well, surprisingly, it shaped much more than just hygiene. It had a profound effect on everything from health and social interactions to the development of the cities themselves. Let's start with one of the most obvious if you lived in a medieval town, especially in the bustling, crowded urban areas, your chances of falling ill due to poor sanitation were significantly higher than those living in the countryside. There was a constant threat of disease, from cholera to dysentery, and outbreaks of the plague were common. Historians still debate how much the lack of sanitation contributed to the spread of the Black Death. But it's clear that the filth and waste that accumulated in cities created the ideal breeding ground for disease. Contaminated water, overflowing cesspits, and unsanitary public latrines meant that the spread of disease was inevitable. But it wasn't just about the waste-poor hygiene practices. Combined with ignorance of how diseases spread, exacerbated the problem. The more people lived in close quarters, the easier it was for diseases to spread. And since the link between waste and disease was not fully understood, medieval people had little choice but to accept their conditions, unaware of how much their environment was contributing to the health crisis around them, beyond the physical health impacts. The presence of waste also shaped social interactions. Imagine living in a town where you constantly had to avoid stepping in waste, or where the stench of human refuse was so overpowering that it made you avoid certain areas. Social life in medieval towns and cities was often centered around markets, town squares, and other communal spaces, but many of these spaces were littered with waste. Public latrines, while essential, were often in the open, making their use a matter of public knowledge. People had little privacy when it came to bodily functions, and this lack of privacy had social implications. Public latrines were often used by the community in a very open manner, and because of this, sanitation became not just a physical issue, but a social one as well. For the nobility, privacy in waste management was a luxury that wasn't afforded to the lower classes. They could retreat to their private garderobes or latrines, but for most, communal facilities like public latrines and cesspits were the only options. There was no sense of private space when it came to using the toilet, and the idea of a personal space for waste was foreign to most people. The way medieval people lived in relation to their sanitation systems also speaks to the broader cultural attitudes of the time. Medieval society didn't place much emphasis on hygiene as we understand it today. The idea of cleanliness was often tied to social class, but it wasn't as much about hygiene as it was about ritual or status. For the wealthy, cleanliness and perfume were about maintaining an image looking pristine and smelling pleasant. But this had little to do with the actual removal of dirt or waste. Even with the access to more private facilities like garderobes, the rich still lived in close proximity to waste. And the social status of privacy didn't necessarily correlate with better hygiene practices. In contrast, the poor, who lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions, had to endure a much more immediate and intimate relationship with waste. Their entire environment was affected by the lack of proper sanitation, and their daily lives were marked by an ongoing struggle with dirt, filth, and the ever-present smell of human refuse. In many ways, this stark contrast between the lives of the rich and the poor is a defining feature of medieval waste management, how social status influenced one's access to better living conditions, even if those living conditions were still far from ideal now. Let's talk about the development of these sanitation systems over time. While medieval toilets were crude, they laid the groundwork for the future development of waste management. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of the knowledge about plumbing and public hygiene was lost. But that doesn't mean people weren't still developing systems to deal with waste. It just meant that these systems were far less sophisticated than what the Romans had established. The major cities of medieval Europe lacked the advanced plumbing of Roman cities, and so waste disposal was largely handled by cesspits, communal latrines, and basic water channels. However, as time passed and the population in cities grew, the need for more effective waste management systems became clear. In the 12th and 13th centuries, some urban areas, particularly in Italy and France, began experimenting with rudimentary sewer systems. These early sewers were generally just channels built under streets to carry waste away from public areas, but they were still groundbreaking for their time. By the 16th century, some cities had begun constructing more advanced sewer systems. That included a network of pipes and drains, moving waste out of residential areas and into more secluded spots. It wasn't just about the infrastructure, though. The rise of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment periods brought about a shift in how waste and hygiene were viewed. The advancements in science and the increasing focus on public health during these times paved the way for the development of modern sanitation systems. New discoveries in medicine, combined with a growing understanding of disease transmission, meant that waste management was finally recognized as a public health priority. Cities began to invest more heavily in sewage systems, and with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, sanitation became a key element in urban planning. The technology that had been developed slowly over centuries finally culminated in the creation of the modern sewer systems we use today. The concept of plumbing, proper sewage treatment, and waste disposal was finally understood in the context of public health. And this understanding led to huge improvements in sanitation worldwide. While the medieval period might seem primitive, when viewed through the lens of modern waste management systems, it was a necessary stage in the evolution of sanitation. Without the rudimentary systems of waste disposal in place, whether it was cesspits, latrines, or garderobes, we wouldn't have had the foundation on which to build the more sophisticated methods that emerged later. What's even more fascinating is that some of the basic principles used in medieval waste management systems are still used today. For example, many cities still rely on underground sewer systems to move waste away from populated areas. The idea of a central disposal area, whether it's a cesspit or a modern treatment plant, is still the most effective way to manage waste. So, while medieval toilets may seem unsophisticated and even unpleasant, they were part of a longer story that eventually led to the hygienic, sanitized environments we live in today. In the end, the story of medieval toilets is one of progress. Through trial and error, the medieval world didn't have modern plumbing or a deep understanding of public health, but they did have the ingenuity to develop solutions to the problem of human waste. Those solutions, though imperfect, paved the way for the sanitary practices we take for granted today. So, as we sit in the comfort of modern bathrooms, let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come from those early attempts at waste management, and how the medieval era, for all its challenges and limitations, helped lay the foundation for the sanitation systems we rely on today. As we've journeyed through the history of medieval toilets and waste management, from the early chamber pots and communal latrines to the grand garderobes in castles, it's clear that while sanitation was an afterthought, it had a profound impact on the development of societies. But what about the religious, cultural, and even philosophical aspects of sanitation in medieval Europe? Believe it or not, toilets and waste management had ties to religious beliefs and were often influenced by cultural norms. In fact, one of the most surprising things about the medieval toilet situation is how connected it was to notions of purity, sin, and morality. Medieval Christian beliefs placed a significant emphasis on cleanliness and the body, viewing bodily functions as something that was inherently dirty, impure, or sinful. This isn't to say that medieval people didn't clean. Themselves they did, though it wasn't in the way we would imagine. For example, while bathing was still common practice in the early medieval period, it gradually fell out of favor, particularly during the later Middle Ages. Part of the reason for this decline in bathing was religious. The Christian Church, particularly during the 12th and 13th centuries, began to associate bathing with indulgence, excess, and even immorality. This is when we start seeing a shift toward viewing personal cleanliness, particularly the act of bathing, as something that could lead to sinful thoughts or behavior. Bathhouses, which were once common and popular spaces, started to fall out of favor as they were believed to promote sexual immorality. So, even though hygiene had a practical purpose, it was also tied to complex cultural and religious beliefs about sin and purity. This moral view of the body extended to toilets and waste as well. Toilets were seen as necessary evils, and in many places, people tried to keep the act of relieving themselves hidden away behind closed doors or in less public spaces. Garderobes in castles were attempts to provide a modicum of privacy, even though the reality of waste disposal was anything but clean. The very fact that garderobes existed in castles and monasteries speaks to a deeper cultural need for personal dignity, or at least a separation of public and private spaces. In monasteries, for example, monks would often retreat to secluded areas of their cloisters to relieve themselves, away from the communal living spaces, perhaps as a reflection of their desire to maintain some semblance of purity and separation from worldly concerns. But this desire for privacy and cleanliness wasn't just about personal comfort, it was also about spiritual purity. As strange as it might sound to us today, medieval people saw waste as something dirty, sinful, and even shameful. And while the act of relieving oneself was natural, the rituals and ways in which waste was disposed of often mirrored these religious ideas of bodily purity. This connection between waste and religious belief also influenced the broader cultural view of public health and sanitation, because many of the early medieval communities were built around religious centers, especially in monasteries, and because the church had so much influence over daily life. The lack of proper sanitation wasn't seen as a health problem in the modern sense. It was, instead, a necessary inconvenience, and the focus remained more on moral and spiritual purity than on maintaining physical cleanliness. Public latrines, cesspits, and garderobes weren't seen as part of an effort to improve the quality of life. They were simply accepted as the way things had to be. It wasn't until the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, when the idea of public health began to take shape, that sanitation started to be considered in terms of human well-being and not just as a moral or religious issue. The medieval period also placed a significant focus on the concept of humility. This concept permeated nearly all aspects of medieval life, including the way people thought about their bodies and bodily functions. Humility, in medieval Christian terms, meant being aware of your own lowliness in relation to God. To be humble was to accept that, as a human being, you were imperfect and sinful. This idea of humility extended to toilets and waste. In a society where sin and impurity were viewed as part of the human condition, it made sense that people would feel shame around natural bodily functions. Even though there were people in the medieval world trying to improve sanitation and create more private spaces for bodily functions, the moral and spiritual significance of waste didn't go away. The design of latrines, cesspits, and even the use of chamber pots was shaped, in part, by the desire to keep waste separate from people's living spaces, as a way to maintain a certain level of dignity. But the shame surrounding bodily functions was also what prevented people from fully understanding the need for better sanitation. If bodily waste was inherently linked to sin, it wasn't something that should be openly discussed or managed efficiently, as strange as it may sound. Toilets in medieval times were not only about bodily function, but also about the spiritual, moral, and social frameworks of the time. The act of relieving oneself, the spaces where this happened, and how the waste was dealt with were all influenced by medieval notions of purity, cleanliness, and humility. People were aware of the need to manage waste, but it wasn't just about hygiene, it was about preserving dignity and privacy. And in the case of public latrines or communal areas, It was about separating the impure from the sacred. This cultural context is essential to understanding why the progress of sanitation during the medieval period was so slow and incomplete. The idea of public sanitation was a foreign one, and the Church's influence on daily life kept the focus on spiritual cleanliness rather than physical cleanliness. Interestingly, the medieval period wasn't just about spiritual cleanliness. There were also practical concerns. Cities that grew rapidly during the medieval period, like Paris and London, had to contend with the increase in waste produced by an expanding population. These cities became breeding grounds for disease, with waste spilling into streets, rivers, and public spaces. At the same time, the wealthy tried to shield themselves from the filth by developing private systems of waste disposal, but they were still faced with the same fundamental issue: how to manage waste in an environment that was growing increasingly crowded and unsanitary. The idea of public sanitation didn't fully take hold until much later, but the medieval period laid the groundwork for the systems of waste management that would emerge centuries later. In the end, while the medieval toilet and waste management systems were crude and unsanitary, they reflected much more than just a practical need. They were an embodiment of cultural, religious, and moral beliefs that shaped the way people lived. The story of medieval toilets is a story of humanity's struggle to balance the practical with the moral, the sacred with the everyday, and the public with the private. As we conclude our exploration of medieval toilets, waste disposal, and the fascinating ways these practices shaped daily life, it's important to understand how these unsophisticated systems ultimately laid the foundation for the sanitation practices we rely on today. Though medieval methods of waste management were primitive and often unsanitary, they were the first steps in the long journey towards modern hygiene. It's easy to look back at the past and find humor or disgust in the state of medieval sanitation. But these early attempts at solving the problem of human waste were crucial to the evolution of public health and urban planning. Without the basic foundations set by the medieval world, our current sanitation systems might have taken much longer to develop. So, despite the filth, stench, and discomfort, the medieval period was, in its own way, an era of innovation, one that pushed the boundaries of waste management, even if the solutions weren't always as clean or efficient as we'd hope. The work done during the Middle Ages to control waste, albeit rudimentary, sparked an ongoing conversation about hygiene, disease, and the need for more organized sanitation systems, which would ultimately pave the way for the modern sewer systems and public health infrastructure we now take for granted. The journey from chamber pots and cesspits to modern plumbing took centuries, and much of the groundwork was laid during this period of early experimentation. For example, the notion of moving waste away from living areas, whether through cesspits, garderobes, or simple drainage channels, represented the beginning of thinking about waste in a more systemic way. Although many of these early systems were inefficient, they planted the seed for later innovations, like the development of municipal sewage systems that would emerge during the Industrial Revolution. By the time of the 19th century, cities across Europe and beyond had begun to adopt more effective ways of managing waste. The knowledge gained through the failures and successes of medieval waste management would eventually lead to the creation of the large-scale plumbing systems that we use today. What's more, the idea of cleanliness itself evolved over time, as societies moved from a medieval mindset, where hygiene was more about ritual and social class, to an understanding of public health as it relates to disease prevention. While medieval people didn't understand germs or bacteria, their efforts to control waste were a testament to human ingenuity. The sheer adaptability of people in these times, given the limited knowledge and technology they had, is remarkable. The implementation of garderobes, public latrines, and even the use of waste as fertilizer might seem crude by modern standards. But in their context, they were the best solutions available. The medieval understanding of hygiene was rudimentary, but as the centuries passed, people's knowledge of disease, sanitation, and waste management grew. The true turning point came in the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, where science began to take precedence, and with it came a deeper understanding of how disease spread. Sanitation moved from being a cultural and moral issue to a public health issue, eventually shaping the modern systems we have today. The link between waste and disease was established, leading to widespread reforms and the creation of modern sewage systems that are responsible for keeping urban populations healthy today. Though medieval toilets and waste systems were far from ideal, they also reflect the ongoing relationship between society, technology, and health. The human body and its functions were seen as impure in medieval thought, and that view extended to how waste was managed. The lack of privacy in public latrines, the often unsanitary nature of chamber pots, and the general filth of medieval streets are a reflection of this attitude. Yet, these systems also show that despite limited understanding, people were still finding ways to manage waste. Castles had garderobes, towns had cesspits, and monasteries designed waste management, systems that separated people from the filth as much as possible. But it wasn't until later that society would fully embrace the importance of hygiene in preventing disease. By the time public health became a recognized issue, we were able to implement the sanitation systems that keep our modern cities clean, healthy, and functional. What's remarkable about this historical journey is the way that medieval people, despite not having the advanced tools or knowledge that we have, were able to solve the waste problem, even if only partially, through their trial and error. They managed to develop a rudimentary understanding of waste management that later inspired the sewage systems we depend on. Today, when we flush our toilets or take a shower, we rarely think about the systems in place that keep us safe. We take for granted the fact that our waste is whisked away to treatment plants, cleaned, and safely disposed of. We rarely have to worry about contamination, diseases like cholera, or the smell of waste seeping into our homes or public spaces. But the fact that we live in a world with modern plumbing is the direct result of centuries of human effort, starting from these early medieval innovations. It's easy to mock medieval toilets and sanitation systems, and to be repulsed by the idea of public latrines or chamber pots. But these were the systems that people in the past had to work with, and they did the best they could. In a time when life expectancy was short, disease was rampant, and personal hygiene was largely neglected, the fact that these systems existed at all is a testament to the resilience of humanity. People adapted to their environment and found ways to survive, finding some comfort in their chamber pots, trying to keep their waste away from their living spaces, and using their waste in ways that, while unsophisticated, helped keep their environment somewhat manageable. These early sanitation systems may not have been ideal, but they were crucial to the development of modern sanitation and public health systems. As we close this chapter on medieval toilets, let's reflect on how far we've come. The unsanitary conditions of the medieval world were not the result of laziness or ignorance, but of the limitations of their time. They paved the way for the modern sewage systems and public health practices that allow us to live in clean, disease-free environments today. So next time you flush your toilet, Take a moment to appreciate the long journey it took to get to this point, then the resilience and creativity of people in the past who, even in their filth, sought a better way.